And this is Sam Tai. I'm interviewing Dr. Vivienne Low for the British Chinese Food Culture Project on June 23rd, 2011. Hello.
Hi.
Dr. Vivienne Low, and I'm very happy to be able to interview you.
Mm-hmm.
And can you spell your full name, please?
Vivienne, and Low is Law, but it's Lo. 我的中文名字是罗莲英，还是罗伟乾，两个名字。
是哪个莲哪个一？
莲花的莲，英国的英。还有，但是我的伯伯，my uncle said this was not appropriate. It was too common and too feminine. So when I became a scholar, he said you have to have another name, and so he called me Wei Qian. That's a 教师旁，一个单立人，一个为前后的前。
And to start the interview, we know you used to study at SOAS, and can you tell us briefly about your studies and your working experience up to that?
Well, I went to university rather late. I didn't go to university until I was 30. So, do you want to know what happened before then?
Yes.
First of all, I worked for Richard Branson in Virgin Records. I was basically a account secretary. And then after that, I worked in development in Africa as a personal assistant to the director of a charitable institution in the Africa Centre in Covent Garden. And then I trained as an acupuncturist. And during that time, I was also training in martial arts, Tai Chi, every kind of martial arts. And after that, I decided it was about time I learned Chinese, because I felt that what I was learning in martial arts and acupuncture and all these things wasn't grounded unless I knew Chinese, and my father hadn't taught me as a child. It's very different when your mother is Chinese. Then of course you have your muyu, your mother language, and my father spoke perfect English, so they never bothered to speak Chinese at home. So by the time I was 30, I thought it's about time I went to university. And so I applied to Cambridge, got into Cambridge and studied a couple of years in Cambridge. By that time I already had 2 children, so it was a bit difficult commuting to Cambridge, so I swapped to SOAS and I graduated from SOAS eventually in the Chinese department, and I went directly on to do a PhD there.
And what's your working experience after?
After that, I had a research fellowship funded by the British Academy for 2 years at SOAS, so I was a long time in SOAS, probably about 8-9 years. And after that, I immediately got a job funded by the Wellcome Trust at the Wellcome Trust Centre for the History of Medicine, which is part of UCL. Actually, it's closing this month, but and I'm moving into UCL History Department and starting a new centre called the China Centre for Health and Humanity.
And you were doing the history of Chinese medical practices.
That's right. For my PhD, I began to study the texts that have been newly excavated from Han Dynasty tombs, and many of those are about medicine, although we have to talk about medicine quite broadly. So my main study is of exercise therapy. So broadly, the origins of the sort of thing we call Qigong or Tai Chi today, and also the origins of acupuncture, because there are the first manuals of acupuncture, and not manuals, treatises on acupuncture and manuals of exercise therapy. So that's my main study, but because I also teach undergraduates, mostly medical students, and then I have my own PhD students, I teach a very wide range of things concerned with Taoist religion, food, modern Chinese medicine in the modern world. I also work a lot on China and the rest of the world. So I work on the China-Persian connections in the late medieval times, and on the manuscripts from Dunhuang in the northwest of China. So I'm interested in the transmission of knowledge along the Silk Roads, particularly medical knowledge.
And why do you want to choose this field of research? Is there any family influence on your choice of career?
On acupuncture, no, because acupuncture was a fairly low-class profession in the eyes of my Chinese family. Most of my Chinese family were diplomats in the previous generation. Actually, prior to my father's generation, they were ambassadors and consuls in various European countries. But during the 30s and 40s and 50s, it wasn't very clear who you would be an ambassador for, which government you'd choose. And although my father did work in the diplomatic field a little during the wartime, there was no career there. In fact, nobody ever paid you because the nationalist government was banged up in Chongqing at the time. And later on, of course, there was no foreign relations for quite a long time. So they were not that interested in my acupuncture work. Of course, they were very happy when I went to Cambridge because previous generations of the family, my father had been there, my grandfather and my great-grandfather before that. So they're very happy that I took academic studies, and of course were happy that I studied Chinese. As far as medicine goes, not particularly, although the acupuncture profession is very interesting in the UK. For a while it became quite well respected, at least it was very popular, and people are interested in lots of ways in Chinese medicine. It changed anyway in the eyes of the family, and of course the next generation thought about it very differently. I also, when my father died, I was sort of forced into the restaurant business, kicking and screaming, and still look after two of the restaurants, mainly for my mother. We have two in Portugal. And I started up one with my sister, the tea house in Eccleston Street, but now she runs that on her own because I'm just too busy and I'm not really that interested in running restaurants.
You just mentioned there are two restaurants, and one is the tea house.
No, that's the third one. There's two in Portugal.
Two in Portugal?
Yes, my father opened them just before he died, and actually they weren't doing very well, and when he died my mother had a stroke, so I thought about closing them, but actually they were earning a bit of money, so it seemed silly since my mother wasn't very well off at the time, so I run them for her really. But I only run them in my spare time, in the summer and sometimes late night when something goes wrong. But for the most part, we have managers down there.
So the business is still very good there.
The business is not bad. It's really serving Germans and British people who are golfers, because it's in a golf resort in Portugal. So one is very similar to Memories of China in London. It's in a very beautiful, manicured Mediterranean resort, and it does extremely good business in 6 weeks during the summer when people are on holiday. The rest of the year nobody goes there. So it's very popular for a short period of time. So it's not great, big business, because it has to rely on those 6 weeks takings and maybe a week at Easter and a week when the public schools are on holiday. It makes a lot of money.
But you still got good business during these 6 weeks.
Oh yes, absolutely fact.
Is it because it's kind of similar to the Campbell's Memories of China?
The menu is one of them is very similar to Memories of China, and it was originally set up by the chefs of Memories of China. And the other one I set up after he died, and by that time things had moved on. So I created the menu and did all the marketing and advertising stuff and the sort of modelling for the restaurant. And we have a sort of pan-Asian restaurant, so it's fundamentally Chinese food, but there's also Japanese food and Thai food and Vietnamese food and Singapore food. So it's all kinds of food really. It was I was originally working with a Macau chef on the menu there.
And you just mentioned your grandfather, your grand-grandfather, they are ambassadors.
My great-great-grandfather was the ambassador here. He was a very interesting man. He had come from, I suppose, a middle, wealthy military family in Fuzhou, but not very prominent. And he studied technical subjects. And both my paternal great-grandfather and my maternal great-grandfather became shipbuilders in the Marway dockyard in Fuzhou on the Min River. And they eventually raised up very quickly, and they came with Yanfu to London. One of them came to London in the 1860s. There was a group sent, and one of them went to Paris. The maternal grandfather went to Paris, and the one that came here learnt navigation at Greenwich Naval College, and the one in Paris, I'm not sure which college he went to, but he learnt hull building for boats. And when they went back, they went on to. My great grandfather was the director of the Marway dockyard, and they built the first modern navy together for China. Of course, that navy got blown out of the water by the Japanese at some point, and Cixi wasn't giving enough money for the modern navy. She preferred her marble boat in Yanmingyuan, is it? No, Yanmingyuan, the Summer Palace. And so after that, what was very interesting was because the top bureaucrats in the government had not learnt English because they were still very conservative about Chinese culture and didn't want to recognise that things were going on of importance in the rest of the world. So nobody, when China suddenly woke up to the fact that they had to do diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, nobody could speak English. So the only people who could speak English were these technicians who'd gone abroad to study. And in fact, my great-grandfather had gone on from Greenwich Naval College to learn algebra and mathematics and philosophy at King's here. And so he was just primed really to do diplomatic relations. So they made him the ambassador to the court of St. James here. And he was here for a while. My great-grandmother died here, in fact, in the embassy. And then he went back in around 1900. And the other maternal great-grandfather went on to be the director of the Huangpo Naval College. I think naval, not army. So that was Wei Han, and my grandfather's name, my paternal great-grandfather was Luo Fenglu. He was knighted by Queen Victoria, so he's Sir Luo Fenglu. In fact, he was Sir Luo Fenglu.
So I think from the very beginning, your father was born in a rather unusual and distinguished family. Has this family background kind of influenced your father's main interests and his career path later?
My father was a lovely man. He was, I miss him terribly. He was very charming, much loved. His grandmother's favourite, and he talks a lot about. They had a very charmed childhood in Fuzhou, and they lived in one of those colonial tea trading mansions that's on the top of the hills in south of the Min River in Fuzhou city. And so he grew up as a small child. Life was absolutely wonderful. And then he describes the coming of civil war. He described that. Really, I didn't listen much when I was a little child, but when I graduated from Cambridge, I understood a bit more about Chinese history. So he told me more at that point when we were writing his autobiography together. He was sitting on the wall when the 8th Route Army came by on the Northern Expedition, which ended up in that disaster in Shanghai. And slowly he became aware he had to get out of Fuzhou. And they went to missionary school, and then he went up to Yanjing Daxue, where his uncle was a professor at the time, Chen Daisun. He's a very famous economist who died only 10 years ago. So just before 1936, I think he graduated from Yenting in English. And he had actually lived in England as a child because his father was a minor consul, had a minor consular job here. So he'd had about 5 years as a small child before he went back to Fuzhou. There was 6 of them, 6 children. And then he managed academic work. He was a bit of a fun-loving guy. You know, he didn't particularly like studying. His elder brother was amazing student, and he went to Tsinghua and ended up in Columbia University teaching the classical Chinese. They also had a classical Chinese training. They were the last generation of students that had private tutors that came, and they first of all learned all the classics, so he could recite the Zhuozhuan and he could recite Mengzi and many texts, and often did. So and also in Fuzhouhua, not in Mandarin. So when in 1935 there'd been quite a lot of student demonstrations against the Japanese from Yenting University, and he was a great sportsman. He'd been trained in tennis by the missionary school that he went to in Fuzhou, and they had a summer house in the hills because it got very hot down there in the summer in the south. So they had a tennis court in the house, and he was a very good tennis player. And when he went to Yenting, he of course participated in all those tournaments and was the champion of North China. And so he had many sportsman friends. So in 1936, just at the point that the Japanese army were coming to Lugoqiao at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, he decided it's time to go. And so he jumped ship with the 1936 Berlin Olympic team and went to Berlin. And after that, he came and signed up at Cambridge to do a degree. So he was there from then and spent a lot of time on the tennis court, not with his books. So he was not a great student, but he passed. He graduated from Cambridge, and at that point he really didn't know what to do. He went into the consul at the time and worked in Liverpool for a few years with Chinese seamen who were in commercial boats and in the navy, and that was a very interesting time for him, but because I think at that time Chiang Kai-shek was in Chongqing, and nobody was paying anybody, so he never got paid. So life was quite difficult, and then when he was there, actually, he talks about Liverpool being the origins of regional Chinese food in the UK, because each of the seamen used to come in groups of men that were associated with one particular village in China, and they would all live together in a house, and in that house they would open up the kitchens to people in Liverpool, to ordinary people in Liverpool, mostly other Chinese, but also anybody else that knew about them. So each one there would be a swatao house, and there would be a shaman house, and there would be all these different houses that were serving different types of Chinese food, just their home food, really. So after that, he really didn't know what to do. For a long time, when I was a child, he was coaching tennis, he was a tennis coach. He had a particular facility because he was quite unlike most other Chinese in the UK at the time, who would have come as sailors, cooks, chefs on the boats, etc. He was much more educated, so he was moving in circles naturally because of his Cambridge education and because of his ability at sports with educated people, and because his English was so good. He never had any money in those years, but he had a sort of ticket to join in with English society because of his education and because everybody thought, he was their favourite Chinaman, basically. And he played up to that. He gave them what they wanted. He would, he could talk philosophy, he could talk politics, he could talk society. His politics were very interesting because he naturally came from a Republican family. But at the same time, when he'd been at Yenjing University, there were many intellectuals who were going off to Yan'an to join Mao, and there were others that were very devoted to Chiang Kai-shek. So he always sat in the middle because he didn't like politics very much. He wasn't very passionate about politics. But when he arrived at Cambridge, it was in the middle of the Spanish Civil War. And all those people that he admired, he was studying literature. And so George Orwell, Auden, all those people that he was associating with, Joseph Needham, Joseph Needham's very famous for his history of Chinese science and technology. He was living in that world, and they were mostly left-wing. They were part of the sort of international socialist movement, often going to fight in the Spanish Civil War. So he has rather left-wing leanings for the kind of family that he came from at that time. So anyway, he wrote a little. He wrote for The New Statesman, for Eastern Eye, and various other kind of Asian China publications. And he tried to do a PhD, but by that time he was getting married and having a family and had to earn money. So I think the first entry into the world of Chinese food for him was as a restaurant reviewer for Egon Ronne. And Egon Ronne at that time used to write something called the Good Food Guide. And the Good Food Guide was just like a Time Out restaurant review. Actually, it was very funny because he would always, as all Chinese, when they're away from home, gravitate towards Chinese restaurants just to feel at home, feel familiar. So really, when the honourable thing for a reviewer is to go in anonymously to a restaurant and write a critical report about the food. Actually, what he often did was he would go to the door, announce that he was the reviewer for the Egon Ronne Food Guide, bring in the kids, and we would get served the best food. Of course, not what was on the menu, but we would eat very well. So he was very funny like that, really. He obviously lamented the life that he'd had in Fuzhou, and he never wanted to go back to China. He was desperate to get out of Fuzhou because he was terrified of having to live in poverty, and because he'd seen the UK as a child, and he'd seen Europe and how developed Europe was at that time, and life without money for him. It's not that he was desperate for money ever, really, but he was desperate for the lifestyle. He didn't want to give up the comforts that he'd had, and it was very charmed. When he describes it, it sounds like Hong Lomang, and he had that kind of childhood with a big garden and lots of food and parties all the time, and tennis and everything. So it was hard for him to face a life with no money in the UK. So I always remember that he never had any money when I knew him. And my uncle would send money because he was doing rather better and didn't have a family in New York. So he'd send money, especially to pay for his membership to Hurlingham. Hurlingham is a very fancy club here where he could play tennis, and so he would go there, and everybody loved him because there were no other Chinese in the place, and he would charm them all. And so we would hardly have any money for food, but he was living very well in the Hurlingham and playing tennis and wandering around the restaurants doing restaurant reviews. So then in the 1950s, he realised that there was no Chinese cookery books. And he was writing. He always wanted to be a poet and wrote a lot of poetry and tried to write novels, but they weren't quite good enough. And so then I had another uncle, and the Chinese family in China. My family really went to all corners of the earth and graduated and went down to all social classes. So my Uncle Michael's story is very tragic, but he ended up on the streets in Shanghai. He was very, very well educated at St. John's in Shanghai, I think. And he was trained in translation, but when they were here as children, he was born here, Uncle Michael, Luo Shaodao, and but the problem is he'd had some childhood illness, and he was deaf, So it was very difficult for him to look after himself. And by the time I met him, he was already 80 or so, and living a very rough life in Shanghai. But during the 50s, what he did was he bought up cookery books, and he sent them to London, to my father. And my father basically translated those cookery books and started writing cookery books in English. So that was during the late 1950s, and that went on and on until he started, basically that's where it started, and he wrote about 40 cookery books in his lifetime and had a few TV shows, and he was really the first to write Chinese cookery books in the UK. You asked me how my father's work was influenced, because he didn't actually open restaurants until he was 70 during the 80s. He didn't. Restaurants for him were a bit of a dirty business, really. I mean, restaurants are a dirty business anyway. But he was not the sort of person who could duck and dive and negotiate and haggle with everybody. He was always the front man for the restaurants, and he would always be there eating and doing the public face of the restaurants. Actually, the person who did the hard work was my mother. And she did all the organisation. She was the one who argued with the chefs. She was the one who did the accounts. And my father just sort of floated around. I mean, he would cook. He would test all the recipes out, but it was more of a creative enterprise than it was a daily job. And he spent most of the time behind the typewriter.
So, do your father like cooking very much? And
he liked eating very much. He cooked rather like me. He cooks very. He would cook on Sundays with my mother, and we'd have a mix of English and Chinese food. He would always take the roast dinner that was made on Sunday and stir fry it on Monday, that sort of thing. So, but he would also test out all his recipes. I remember actually the funniest story is when he was in Liverpool and he was asked to, I don't know, it was some community event, maybe a church event or something, and I think it was the first public food event he'd ever done. And he arrived at the venue and he was going to cook chicken soup, so they'd asked him to produce chicken noodle soup, and they'd asked him to sort of produce this, and they had produced 2 crates of chickens live, and all there was tea urns. So he tells how he got somebody to go and chase up a surgeon, student friend of his, to come and kill the chickens and skin the chickens and defeather them, and then he stuck the chickens in the tea urns and boiled them up in the tea urns, so that when he turned on the tap, chicken soup came out, and then he put in the noodles, and that was his first event. And then my mother and father met in the International Student House, I think somewhere in Gower Street at the time, and they used to put on sort of cultural events together. So they'd cook Chinese food for the club, and so he enjoyed all of that, and he did cook at home, and he was often in the kitchen. And one thing I always remember myself is that if we were upset, if things were going wrong, and we were a wild, crazy teenage family, the 4 of us, very badly behaved, and when things went wrong, he would never talk to us. He would always produce hong sha ro, or some other kind of food, which was a kind of comfort food, And so he wasn't very emotionally expressive, but he was always there and supportive, and that support really came through cooking.
Do the children like their food, your father's food?
Oh yes. Although the one thing I didn't like was when I get a boiled egg for breakfast, soft boiled egg for breakfast, and he would sort of creep up behind me and put soy sauce in it. I preferred salt, and just the black inside the egg yolk looked so disgusting to me as a child. But no, we loved Chinese food, and because for a period, when my mother thought he was rich because he was so educated, and she was actually much richer than him. So we lived in Hampstead when I was born. I remember very sunny years. There was a lot of people. There were all this intellectual crowd that he knew from from Cambridge. There was Arthur Waley, who did all the early translations of the Warring States philosophers, and William Emerson. We lived in his house. He was a great philosopher. And so those were really sunny years, and I remember them very vividly as the happiest years of my life, really. But then he went bankrupt. At that time, actually, he was importing Chinese handicrafts, and he had a shop in South Kensington. So all those running horses, and I don't remember the artist, but they were very famous black and white ink drawings of horses. He imported them, printed them, and made Christmas cards out of them, and this sort of thing. But anyway, he never had a head for business. He was not trained as a businessman. So that went bankrupt. And then we had to move out to Surrey. So when Chinese restaurants always came with coming up to London and being with Dad, and because I loved my dad so much, it was a great thing. And we'd always do the New Year celebrations in Chinatown, and they were fun events. And we ate, all of us ate. We picked up, both my father and my mother loved cooking. My mother was trained by Egon Ronnie himself, and she was a caterer. So they cooked well at home, and we'd have a mix of Chinese and English food, and she would always do lots of puddings and English style, and my father would especially make hong sha roll. I like red meat with lots of fat, and very 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 much not a dieter. So fatty meat is a big thing. But then in China, fatty meat, before this last century when people are catching on to being so skinny, fatty meat was a really important thing. It showed you were wealthy. And if you were a bit fat, that was a good thing.
Is there a particular reason why your father is so into hong sha roll?
Isn't everybody into hong sha roll who really likes their food? You don't like hong sha roll?
No.
Oh, it's too fatty. Yes, that's because you're a sad victim of 20th century dietary mania. No, I don't know. Well, hong sha roll. I think the upper generation all like hong sha roll, don't they? Certainly, in Beijing, my ayi's always made it for me, but everybody makes it slightly differently. And is there a reason why I liked it? Well, my feeling is that everybody liked it. Everybody who likes food likes it, and it's just so warming. And particularly when I was traumatized, when I'd split up with a boyfriend or things weren't going well, he'd make me hong sha roll, and it's just rich and comforting. And in fact, I think there's a pot of hong sha roll downstairs which my daughter has made. I told her yesterday, one of my students had brought me some hongzao, some jujube, red dates from Taiwan, and she didn't really know how to make it, so I told her she's taking her A-levels at the moment, and I said she had to make it because I was going to Oxford, and left instructions, so we can go and take. You won't taste it. Somebody else here might taste it. we could check out third generation hong sha roll.
Your father is a gourmet.
Yes.
And does he have any favorite or least favorite dishes?
Least favorite dishes is a very funny thing, because I'll start with myself. When I went to nursery, or the first year in primary school, we had to have school dinners, and they'd sit us in the village hall at the time where we had to have school dinners, and that we'd on tables of about 6 people with a teacher on every table. And they used to serve cubed beetroot with vinegar. It's pickled in vinegar, and they'd serve it with mashed potatoes. So the mashed potatoes is very white, and the pickled beetroot is very red, and all the pink goes in the mashed potatoes. Anyway, the teacher would sit there until he finished everything, and I just felt so sick of it. And then I dream at night of people forcing me to eat bowls full of beetroot. Later on, when I was writing Dad's autobiography, I came to some notes that he'd written, and it was all about beetroot and how disgusting beetroot was. And this would have been in about 1915. So it was obviously a genetic thing that he'd passed down to me, or his dreams. Maybe he was having nightmares as well. His dreams passed on to me. So he really didn't like beetroot. Otherwise, beer. All of my family have that allergy to alcohol, to some types of alcohol, like Asian flush, our eyes go red, and I don't feel drunk, but just feel uncomfortable and sleepy. And he had it very badly. So there was one time when he was at some fancy restaurant in Paris, and they gave him a champagne sorbet. He ate the champagne sorbet, didn't know that he had a glass of champagne, I suppose, and had to be taken to hospital in a coma. I found out a very interesting thing only last Friday night, because I was sitting at the history department annual dinner next to a chemist, and the chemist said, as I recounted about my allergy, he said, that's very easily solved. So what you have to do is drink 10-year-old wine, because under 10 years there are histamines in the wine, and basically that's what sets up the allergic the allergic reaction in your body. So you just have to drink this very expensive wine. For me, actually, it's not a problem with spirits. I can drink whiskey, no problem at all. But red wine is very difficult. So now I'm even more expensive to keep than I used to be, because I have to drink 10-year-old wine only.
If your father has a kind of allergy to drinking, and how did he get away with, drinking a lot in a lot of socializing?
He didn't. He never drank. He only drank tea.
Even in a club or something?
He didn't enjoy drinking. No, he didn't have to. He just drank tea. I think because he was the only Chinese in a particular kind of environment, he could do anything he wanted, really, because he was strange, and everybody thought, well, that's just Chinese, and they excused him. And then, of course, in Chinese environment, he wasn't in that. Nowadays, when I go to conferences in China or meet with any government people, it's all gangbei, gangbei, gangbei. And you have to really, if you don't want to be drunk, you have to really control it or say no. In fact, I was at a wonderful party in Dujiayan, in the epicenter of the earthquake in Sichuan, with one of my martial arts teachers last month. And his school and his house had been brought down by the earthquake, and he'd moved, and so all of his deeds that had come from all over China to, I don't know what you call it, but to celebrate his moving into his new house with their hongbao and their red envelopes and lots of money. And I was sitting next to his 103-year-old Qigong teacher, who is from this Taoist sect from Qingchengshan, and he was amazing, this 103-year-old. He could still thread a needle without any glasses, and still teaching Qigong or Tai Chi for 3 hours a day. Anyway, he didn't drink either. But everybody else, all these burly martial arts heroes, some of them I recognised from the TV, and some of them were young kids who'd travelled all the way across China with their backpacks. Other ones were government officials and security people. They were all completely drunk by the end of it. But the 103-year-old teacher didn't drink, he only smoked. So all these guys were coming up, and I was there because I was the international guest. The international guests always get looked after well. So he and I were chain smoking, because all these martial arts heroes were bringing us alcohol we refused to drink, so they just made us smoke their cigarettes, and every time they gave us a cigarette we had to keep smoking. But you asked me, what food did Dad like?
Yeah.
Well, he liked so much. It's hard to say that he had a favourite. He'd always talk about the great banquets that they had in Fuzhou, and they would start with chicken noodle soup, but then they would go on and on and on. And at tea time they'd drink English tea, because they'd all been in England, so they had silver teapots and porcelain and everything. In Yanji, there's so many things. He liked everything, really, and food from all over China. But I always remember it was very cold in Beijing after he'd grown up in Fuzhou. So he would always go down to the East Market, Dong'an Sitang, and eat lamb. So the barbecued lamb, I suppose from Xinjiang, with a bit of cumin, and then also lamb with sesame sauce. So that was the sort of market, entertainment, student life in Beijing. Also, he would say that in the winter, when that lake in Beida was frozen, they would put persimmons. Persimmons it's not silio, because silio is pomegranates. It's a bit like that. But he put it outside his window, and so it was like a sorbet in the morning. So he cut it open and then spoon out because it's so frozen. And then he'd talk about, well, food was full of sea cucumbers, sweet soups, oyster pancakes, or oyster omelettes actually. Then a lot of fish, river fish, and not dandan noodles, but because it wasn't Sichuan style, but something like that. So on the boats on Min River, they would sell noodles with sesame sauce and just chopped up spring onions. Oh, I know particularly. It's something he always tried to recreate in England, not very successfully. But what he called wine sediment paste, which is lao, I think, some kind of lao. But it's made from, when you make wine, it's the dregs of the wine. It's what's left over after you've made the wine. And they would make that into a food paste, which makes, I know the word, but I've forgotten it. I think it's lao. Anyway, it was made from lao. And it's basically a red paste, which has a sort of wine flavour to it. And they use it, they cook, you just really have to boil chicken in it, and the chicken goes red on the outside, and then you slice it. And so he made, if you just read his cookbooks, you'll realise, he made many substitutes for the kinds of sauces that, he would have made that substitute sauce with wine and probably some vinegar and other kinds of things, because at that time, if you're writing for the British public in the 1950s, they can't even get soy sauce. They can't buy soy sauce. They certainly can't buy this lao sediment paste. And sesame oil, they can't get that. So he made up all sorts of tricks to create accessible Chinese food.
Are these substitute sauces, are they successful? Can it be?
Well, of course not. But, it's something anyway. There was various... Now, what did he use for soy sauce? I can hardly remember now. But there was a substitute for soy sauce. I can find that for you later. And there are all sorts of substitutes in his book. You can't get hua jiao or any of those kinds of things in those days. No, you can, of course. But even so, people don't go out and buy it. So a lot of the cookery books that you'll see, they're not very authentic. But at least they got people cooking differently in the UK.
When is the first Candles Memory China set up? Do you remember?
I remember I was pregnant with my first child, so it was 1979, 1980 maybe by the time it was open.
And when your father named it Candles Memories of China?
That was it. So that was the first Memories of China in Ebury Street. Was it 79? Pretty sure it was 79. Yes. I was in Oxford at the time, yes.
And what has actually inspired your father to set up a high-class restaurant?
I suppose that the years before, I can't even remember what he was doing. He was writing cookery books, and he had set up a club called the Chinese Gourmet Club, and that was really on his experience as a restaurant critic. So he knew all the restaurateurs and he knew the chefs. And so what he'd do is take people, wealthy English people who loved Chinese food, and scholars who were interested in Chinese food. And he had a club out of these people, and they would go to different restaurants, and he would arrange special menus that you couldn't get if you just went by yourself to the restaurant. So through those connections, he knew anyway a lot of wealthy people who just encouraged him to open a restaurant. My mother, we were already growing up, late teenage years, so they were a bit freer, and my mother has always been very ambitious, so she was the one, really the driving force behind the restaurants. I don't think my father probably even wanted to do it. But in the early years it was tremendously successful, and Memories of China as a brand is still very successful in the UK. It's always been continuously successful. So his blueprint for that restaurant was very acceptable to the European customer, to the English customer. Both the menu and the style at the time of the first Memories of China. So life just flowed along, and he went with it, really. And he really enjoyed the success. And he was always terrified of not having any money and not being able to live well. So it seemed like a route to comfort in the beginning, and it was actually quite tough in reality.
You said the restaurant has been continually successful, but is there a certain period of time that the restaurant is most prosperous?
Well, in the first years it was very prosperous, which is why they set up the second one, which was in Chelsea Harbour. And that was the downfall of my father's management of those restaurants. The Chelsea Harbour restaurant, Marco Pierre White went down there. Very famous restaurateurs went bankrupt in that place, or at least basically the restaurant failed. And Memories of China was the last one really to hang on there, because my parents didn't know the sharp business practice, what you had to do in order to survive. I won't go into details about that, but the tricky sort of close to the edge legal things that you need to do to keep a restaurant alive. They had basically set up two incredibly successful restaurants, but then the recession came, and the particular site in Chelsea Harbour was a very bad site, because there were extremely wealthy people living in the harbour, but not that many of them, and often they didn't live there, so there was no custom in the harbour itself, and then there was no passing trade, so you weren't in a situation where people would just drop in for a meal from around the corner. So basically the conditions there were very bad, and they spent too much money on that restaurant, and it failed, so the whole thing had to be sold on just before he died. And so it's continuously successful, because the menu is exactly the same as the one my father set up. The chef in the main restaurant is exactly the same as the one that was almost a son to my father. And so those were very sad days, really, watching my father. And I wasn't involved, I was studying Chinese at the time. They were very sad days, because just before he died, he lost all his money. He could see that he was going to lose the house. And that, for him, was just unfaceable, really. He couldn't... it's not loss of face, it was loss of lifestyle, and the fear of poverty, which he'd always lived it. And he was never really that poor in Chinese, in Chinese standards. His brothers in Beijing and Shanghai were living much worse lives, but it was that anxiety of losing everything. And he lived at that time in a very beautiful house in Pimlico. And the thought of losing it, which was inevitably going to happen because of what happened with the restaurants, was too much for him, and he died. I think that's why he died early, actually. And it was pretty nasty, the passing on to the next owners. They didn't treat him well at all, for the record. And it was shocking, really. So, and they kept his name on the restaurants, which at the time was really painful, because they didn't have anything to do with him. They didn't give him any, extra money for his name or anything. So, I think that stuck in the throat for the family, but also particularly for my father. So his last year or so was not happy, really.
So at that time it must be a very hard decision to make to sell the restaurant.
To sell the restaurants? They couldn't do anything else, really. Well, they could have done. Other restaurateurs, as I've watched, burn their restaurants and pick up on the insurance, or they bankrupt them and start up in a new name, and nobody loses any money. That's normal restaurant practice, but it's quite illegal. And of course, my parents couldn't face that. They weren't tricky enough to run restaurants. All restaurant owners are very, very tricky, just because it's difficult to survive. They all employ people illegally, and they don't pay their tax, take cash and what have you. So they didn't do any of that. And if you don't do any of that, you have to have some other trick up your sleeve, like being very different to other restaurants, which they were initially. But of course, there was the one bad business decision they made to go into Chelsea Harbour. and actually to go to Portugal in the first instance, because they didn't understand this 6-week business that they do down in Portugal. So you can't employ expensive chefs, and you can't, they spent a lot of money, but far too much money down there.
And before your father passed away, did he give you, like the children, did he tell you something that he hoped you should do in the future in terms of business or?
No. No, the only thing he did was, as those restaurants were going down, he pleaded with me to take the school, the cookery school, and open some restaurant there, me and my sister. And of course I was in the middle of my PhD at the time, didn't need to do that. I had 3 children at that time, and very, very busy. I hadn't any money myself in those years. And so the last thing I wanted to do was go and cook and set up a restaurant. But at that time, there was a young man who now you'll know of, Alan Yao. Okay, so he came by, and he was very respectful of my father. And I remember the day he came with a gang of people, his wife and Mog Morishima, who was his architect at the time. And they came to pay their respects to my father, really. And I talked to them about this tea house project, and they basically helped me set it up and helped me with the menu and the marketing and everything. So I'm very grateful to Alan. And then I was less and less involved with that. My sister took it over completely, and that's still running to this day. And that makes decent money for my sister. And so that was the only request he made of me. He was a very different father, unlike what most people imagine Chinese fathers to be, partly because he'd had this strange international life starting from a young child, and partly because I think his family was so wealthy that they really didn't have much to do with childcare. The servants would look after the kids. And the reason why he was very knowledgeable about food was the particular servant that he loved. They had many, many servants in their house. The particular servant that he loved was Ching Ching. And Ching Ching was the chef. And so he spent all his time in the kitchens. And Ching Ching would tell all the stories taken from Xi Ji and all the Ming novels. So he'd spend his time eating in the kitchens and listening to the stories, and martial arts stories and that sort of thing. And he was always in the kitchen. The kitchen was not in the house; it was outside. So he has lovely stories about the time when my grandfather was foreign relations officer for Fuzhou City, and so all the warlords would come to his house, and their armies would be in the garden. And so he would be with Ching Ching feeding the armies and the bodyguards and playing with the guns and doing all those things. So that was really the kind of context within which he first understood about food.
So it's not actually the family influence, it's the influence from a servant, Ching Ching.
Ching Ching, yeah, and Ching Ching was a very faithful servant who, in 1949, they took the house. The Jia Fangzun took the house, the Liberation Army, and then they gave them a smaller house. Actually, it was bigger than ordinary folk, but they gave the family what is now a sort of 4 apartments in one building, and it had a garden around it. And in the garden they buried my great-grandfather, who was the ambassador here. So when I went there in 1988, they were all buried in the garden, all the relatives, and it was moderately comfortable house. It didn't have a chou-shui maton. It only had a hole in the garden, but everything else was rather smart compared to what other people were living in. And the garden was very beautiful because Ching Ching had kept the garden and Ching Ching had stayed with my grandfather really till they all died. So he was a very faithful servant. My grandfather always maintained that his lot was okay after the revolution because they used to keep orchids in the garden, and so he spent a lot of time gardening and dog walking. and walking in the hills. So when after liberation they made him a road sweeper. So he said it's the same thing. He spends the time sweeping the leaves on the streets of Fuzhou rather than walking in the hills with the dogs.
You just mentioned the cookery school.
Yes.
What inspired your father to establish the cookery school? I think it's the first cookery school in Europe.
Yes, and it was Pan-Asian as well. They had all kinds of quite eminent cookery experts who taught there. So Siri Owen, I remember, and Campo Butt, who's still the chef at Memories of China in Ebury Street. Who else? I can't remember, it's so long ago now. But people who are now quite famous. They had a shop. I suppose they had this unit at the back of Memories of China, and they needed to do something with it. And there seemed to be a need. And there were other cookery schools really suddenly being set up all around London. So I think he was in that world where people were doing that. And my sister used to run them, Jenny Lowe, and my mother would sous chef for my father, and there seemed to be a need for it. So it was just an extension of the cookery writing, really. I think something that's really funny is that because he couldn't be an ambassador or a minor consul or anything for China, he became the cultural ambassador for China, and I think almost had more influence on the transmission of Chinese culture to the UK than my great-grandfather, who was the ambassador, because even now, if you talk to people of my generation, they all have his cookery books. So he really took Chinese culture into people's kitchens in a way that nobody had done before.
And can you tell us something? How your father write cookery books? I mean, 40 cookery books, that's a huge number even in the publishing industry now. Yeah.
Well, because that uncle, who was an itinerant, basically a homeless person in Shanghai, would go around all the bookshops in the 1950s and 60s, buying up all the cookery books, and he'd post them to my father. And my father would then translate them, try them out, and that's how he did it. Not because he'd spent, and because he knew the flavour, because he'd eaten so much in all the top establishments he'd always talk about Dong Lai Shun or all these famous restaurants in Beijing and in Fuzhou. And he'd lived in Shanghai as well in the 1920s. And so he'd eaten all the best food all over China. So he knew what it tasted like. He didn't know how to do it, although he had watched Qing Qing doing the basics back in Fuzhou. And then he received these cookery books, and he used all that experience and his experience of English society and English shops and what was available. He created these substitutes. In those days there was only Amoy soy sauce, which was in a can. I don't even know if that still exists, but I remember it very clearly, a yellow can. That's the soy sauce that would go in my boiled eggs. But he would just translate it. He was a genius of translation, really. And then he would try the food out, and there was horrible food to be had in the house during those experiments. And in fact, once he was commissioned to write a Chinese food book for animals, and he gave diarrhea to all the animals in the house. That was very funny. Chinese food for cats. I don't know, but I don't think it was ever published. I've never seen it, but he certainly started working on it. And then he would work with. I mean, when somebody asks you to write a cookery book, there's always a point at which you do the photographic sessions, and he'd be working with quite famous European chefs or cookery writers. So he slowly gained quite an experience in the process of writing cookery books. And they got better as they went on, as he began writing those books with his chefs who really knew how to cook. Campo Butt, for example, was trained in Hong Kong. So he then came to, I think it was a restaurant called the Golden Duck that he was working in. But, he came from several generations of chefs. So then Dad would work with him and and so and then the products became more and more available during the 80s, and so he wrote some very useful cookery books during that time, and they were the ones, Campo Butt and my father, who really created this British Chinese food, in my view. They set the blueprint at Memories of China for the sort of upmarket Chinese restaurants all around the UK, and that style has a Hong Kong sort of base, but it adds in some rather innovative dishes, and it's terribly sweet.
Did your father give any comment on different regional cuisines in China?
Yes, he wrote a book called Regional Chinese Cooking, and he certainly there are dishes like ma yi xiangshu, ants climbing the trees. So that's different in most recipes, but he would do dan dan noodles. He would do what he calls. He made up some dishes which have really caught on, like, and maybe it's not even made up. I've never had these dishes in China, like the Sichuan chili beef, which seems to be the process involves washing soda, I think, or something like that. But anyway, you soften the meat with something inconceivable, really, and then you bash it, and then you probably soak it, marinate it in something, and then you put some kind of batter on it, and you deep fry it, and then you turn it in chili sauce. It's very tasty, actually, but it's very adjusted to the European palate. And when the Sichuan food, they couldn't eat yin yang huoguo or any kind of huoguo that really emanated in Sichuan. And mapo tofu, they always had mapo tofu in the restaurant, but it hardly burnt your mouth at all. When you eat it in Chengdu or Chongqing, British people can hardly eat that at all.
Are there any interesting thing, memorable thing happened in Ken Lo's memory of China?
Wow, many memorable things, really. There were often fights between the chefs, and there was one time, and I can't remember which chef it was, who was particularly angry and raised his chopper and chased another chef all the way around the restaurant with everybody eating out there in full swing. And they were very, well, kitchen staff are hot-tempered just because it's hard work and high pressure at certain moments, and there's always hierarchy problems in the kitchen. So that was something. We had all sorts of famous guests, which I can't tell you the stories about because it would be unprofessional and unethical. And they would all talk about these awful habits of all these famous guests. But what else that was memorable? Well, there were the dragon boat races, which started up back in the 80s. In Memories of China, I wasn't there a lot of the time, apart from on Sundays. We had so many lovely family meals. In fact, the one that I really remember is when all the family were there, and I started having contractions with my second child. So that started off the birth of Aaron. And what else, really? Just the hard work and the design and all those good memories, really.
So now when you think of Ken Lo's memory of China, what kind of feeling do you have?
Well, I'm not one to hold on to the past, the bad things about the past. I tend to let them slip away. And when I do think about those years when he died, I feel really tremendously sad. Just because he didn't deserve to have such misery in his last year, and it was the other restaurateurs that made that misery, apart from obviously the loss of money and the bad business choices they made themselves, but they didn't behave decently. And I think we were all sad, and the chef that's still in that restaurant was very sad because it sort of ripped up that whole world for them. When I think about, but I don't think about that much, and when I think about those earlier years, it's with great fondness and happiness, really.
Can we consider your your sister Jenny's tea house as a kind of continuation of your father's family business of the catering industry?
I don't know, because in some ways my father would have thought it was a low-class operation to have a restaurant. You know, he would have rather been a scholar and a poet, and you know, writing was okay. Writing cookery books was also what he did in the end. But we don't think of it as a family trade, really, as other restaurant families might do. Jenny might feel very differently, because of course she has poured much more of her time and effort into the tea house. You'd have to ask her, really. I really didn't think of it as, you know, I was already in a different world myself with my own profession. So it was a hobby for me, really, and it's still a hobby. You know, it's something I do. Looking after the restaurant for my mother is something that I do as a hobby, and when I'm on holiday in Portugal. So it's combined with my children's being at the sea, and we do tennis, and you know, we have a nice time down there. So I don't think of it as a family business. I mean, obviously, it has affected my own academic studies, but the tea house, you know, I don't think that I'm going to hand on the restaurant business to my children. And Jenny doesn't have any children, so and neither do my brother's children. They're not likely to take up the business. So it was almost something of a certain period in our lives. And for Jenny, it's become her career, but for the rest of us, not. Although I'm always constantly interested in it, but some of the worst days of my life were in the tea house when there were periods when we went through very bad times, and you know, there were recessions, and maybe we didn't get it right, and I had to cook in the kitchens, and I'm too delicate for that. No, although I can do it, and I cook a lot myself. You know, I always have. Well, actually, I decided this year to stop having parties, but last year I had so many parties with hundreds of people in this house and in the garden out there. And partly it's because, you know, my mother, having trained in catering, and then suddenly realising in the early years, before there were restaurants, before Dad had a profession, that he didn't have any money, that she had to go out to work. So while he was trying to write books and not doing very well, he never made good contracts for his books. So he never made money on the books, even though he had so many and they were so popular. He was a very bad business person. So my mother, when we were kids, looked after us, 4 of us, and went to work, and she was the caterer for Epsom schools. So she would do 1,000 meals a day in school dinners, and she'd come home smelling like a deep fat fryer. You know? So she was doing really basic food production.
It seems that your father and your mother have been working so closely. And can you tell us what's the relation like between your father and mother?
Well, bit of racism on either side from the families. You know, my mother's family my grandmother was posh military family. She married, in her family's view, down in the world. She married a relatively rich middle-class farmer, but he died rather early on. So, but his mother thought of herself as a sort of upper class kind of person. So my mother married, but my mother was a wild child in the war years, so her marrying a Chinese was a bit of a rebellion, and they looked down upon it a bit. My father, when he wrote home, was discouraged from marrying an English woman, and neither of them were going to listen to their parents, and they met in International Student House here. He was much older than her, and so they were very much in love in the first years, I think, and until Dad went bankrupt, and then it was very difficult for many years. Actually, they lived separately when the family moved to the countryside, to Surrey, And those were very hard years. But then actually the restaurant business put them back together again. And they worked very intensively together through the late 70s and 80s and sort of reconciled lots of the problems that they had had. We were not easy children. We were very wild children. And that challenged them a lot because my father had no capacity to understand the problems that mixed blood, mixed ethnicity children were going to experience during the 70s and 80s. So he was he a bad father? He wasn't a very engaged father, so he didn't have ways of dealing with the psychological issues of identity and of, because we were very mixed class in the sense that my experience and my friends were from all over the social classes. Actually, probably not educated classes to begin with. I didn't expect to go to university. He wasn't a father who pushed on education like ordinary Chinese fathers would, or Chinese parents would. So it was very different. They were sort of making it up as they went along. And in many respects, it didn't work very well for us. And we didn't get a good education as young children or as teenagers because they hadn't prioritised that. They hadn't understood that that was going to be necessary for us. And so those issues, the sort of meta-family issues, were extremely hard for my father because in China he wouldn't have had to deal with that because the culture itself deals with it. And he was outside of his culture. So how to deal with the mix of being a liberal in terms of his parental, very laissez-faire in the way he handled his children. He never told me off, never told me to do this or to that, but he never told me to do anything. So actually as a teenager, there's a great pressure on you then when you have too many choices. And my mother was always very hands-on and always shouting because she was under a lot of stress, working, producing 1,000 meals a day, coming home, cooking, cleaning, doing everything herself. So those years were very difficult in the 70s and 80s for them. And then they got back together again, and I think they were very close in their deteriorating times. Although my mother was always a very passionate person, my father was very unpassionate in a way, very warm, but never shouting, never arguing. He'd always close up. But at the same time, he was always this charming person there in my life, and it was lovely.
What's the most important thing you learned from your father?
Whoa.
Is there a message or something like that?
He wasn't that kind of person. He didn't have messages. Because every now and then he would. I think because I'm a big mix of my father and my mother, so I work hard like my mother, and she was a Protestant, and we talk about the Protestant work ethic, and we all have that. And for all of us, it's a tension because we also have the desire for pleasure, eating well, exercise. We all like a lot of exercise, which Dad did, and most of the time I think I should be able to get up late and enjoy my breakfast and sit down at my typewriters for a couple of hours work, and that's quite enough. But actually life isn't like that, and in order to keep my job I have to do a lot more than that. So there's a tension in that. And so when I listen to my father, I do try and I try and talk to him these days even. And actually more than anything I talk to my uncle, who was in a sense had much more influence on my life in terms of my choices. But it's not really that my father influences my professional life. It's more that he loved me and we'd laugh. And when I talk to him, I am joking with him. So he helps me relax. He helps me feel like it doesn't really matter, all these day-to-day struggles that everybody has. And that there are things more important. In fact, he took me to my first Taiji lesson. And strangely, it was with a Taiji teacher who was an opera singer, an Australian opera singer. So nobody with any Chinese culture embedded in them at all. In fact, the irony of my life is everything that I've learned Chinese has been taught by Jews by Australians, by in the early years when I was a teenager. In these later years, of course, I had many collaborations with China, and I've lived in China, but in those early years, it was always foreigners who taught me Chinese things, which is very interesting. And acupuncture I learned from an Englishman. And so my route to establishing expertise in things Chinese has been very circuitous, very roundabout, and so my accent is terrible. And my accent I first learned from a Jewish guy in Cambridge. And then in SOAS it began to be Chinese, and then I went to Taiwan and I couldn't say sh, and then I went to Beijing and I picked up the and then most of the time I'm with English people, foreigners speaking Chinese, and my accent and my Chinese is a mess.
But thinking in retrospect, your father seems to be a very versatile, talented, and person with many skills. And there seems to be so many possibilities for him to achieve, during his lifetime. So, what do you think? What has made your father so devoted to Chinese food and the catering industry, and what made him so successful in the end?
Well, first of all, his love of Chinese food, and also the sudden divorce from Chinese culture in 1936, ending up in Cambridge having to drink beer and eat cheese with Cambridge dons, creates a longing, and that longing is expressed through food. So the memories of the family, and of course Chinese family means food. So he never saw his mother again after 1936, and he was very close to his mother. His mother was a very strong character. And all the women in the Wei family were strong characters. So it's almost like an umbilical cord to Fuzhou in those years before politics really shaped the lives of that generation. So the draw is expressed through the need for food. And because he was so well trained or so immersed in Chinese food all over China, it was a kind of knowledge which he could suddenly capitalise on when he was really poor. It was money. It was a way of developing those relationships he had with British society. And it was a possible profession. He also didn't want to get a job. He was too spoilt in his life to want to ever have a job which went from 9 to 5. He didn't really thrive like that. He wanted to be a writer. So his career was more an extension of his life than it was a job. And he found a woman who didn't force him to get a job, because she was such a hard worker herself. So they had a very liberal, modern relationship in the 60s, 50s and 60s. And he found an unusual woman in my mother who would support that. So I think all those factors together.
And your father seems to be a very lucky man also.
Mostly he was lucky. He always wore red. And he was still worried about demons and spirits, even late into his life, although he would say he wasn't. But I think Chinese are always worried by demons and spirits, even if they say they're not. He would actually, even into late life. I remember once, he'd hate it when we went away because he was very dependent on social groups. You know, he liked friends and people around. And even though he wasn't a great father, he would, in Chinese terms or in European terms, he loved to have us around. And if we'd all go away, sometimes he would do things like, I caught him once having crossed the tennis rackets in front of the front door, which was just a way of beating off demons, I think, in his own terms.
And we have several questions on what we are doing the research we are doing for the British Chinese food project. The first is compared to the time when the first Canlo's Memory of China was set up, and do you feel Chinese food has changed?
I can barely eat in most Chinese restaurants because it's so slushy and brown, the food that is churned out. And because now I myself have eaten all around China and really understand more what good Chinese food is. Now, that menu that my father created with Campo But in Memories of China was a very successful menu, and that has been replicated all around Britain in the sort of actually probably rather expensive range Chinese restaurants. The takeaway Chinese I couldn't eat in then and I can't eat in now. And those probably have got a bit better because the competition is greater now. In those years, there really were no Sichuan restaurants. Regional food hadn't developed. Even though my father said it was there in Liverpool, I don't think it had developed from that point, from wartime onwards in the UK. Obviously, there was always the possibility of eating well in Chinatown. But I think the trade in products is much greater. So we have the Wing Yips now, and we have the Chinese supermarkets, and we have Vietnamese supermarkets and Thai supermarkets all around London. And that means that different styles of Pan-Asian cooking are much better represented. And then there was the years around when we were setting up in the tea house in the mid-90s, when there was more of an emphasis on healthy eating, and so consciousness. In the first years, people would say, and I do believe it's true, that Chinese food would stir fry, and they'd make a distinction between stir frying and deep frying. Deep frying being something that UK always did with batter for long periods, and of course in stir frying you actually do deep fry, but you only deep fry for a very short time, really to seal the meat more than anything else, or seal whatever it is you're cooking. So it was an improvement even back then with the stir fry, and because you're not supposed to stir fry until the vegetables are soggy, so you're still retaining some of the nutritious elements of the vegetables, but still it was fried. And so there was a period, I think late 80s, early 90s, when people slowly began to realise that deep fried food, or fried food generally, including the stir fry, wasn't the best food for you. In actual fact, in China, as you know, as much of the food is steamed, so stir fry only represents one element of the kinds of food you would have in a meal. Although there's more stir fry in home food than there is in restaurant food, because there's no ovens and there's no caviar and there's no there's no roasting, because that tends not to be home cooking. But so it moved on from stir fry to this kind of Japanese Asian mix, a Japanese Chinese mix. So you'd have more raw food, which of course, even though I know that sushi is an early Chinese recipe and then was recreated in Japan, although maybe they had it before in Japan too, but there are sushi recipes going back to Liji, which is well into the Warring States period. But that fell out of fashion in China at a certain time. But in any case, if you talk to Campo But, he will say, now we don't do so much stir frying, we do more steaming, we do put in less sugar, we don't use MSG, but I don't really believe him. And so there was awareness of that, the flavour powders. My mother always, it's very funny, because Campo But and my mother always had a very tricky relationship. He was the head chef and she was his boss, but he was really the boss. Well, that's what he thought. So my mother gets migraines, and so whenever my mother had a really bad argument with him, there would be extra weight in MSG put in her food, so that she pushed the head out. and so, although he might curse me for saying so, I love that chef, really do. But in any case, has Chinese food changed? Well, we've got Chili Cool around the corner, which is a great Sichuan restaurant, and still most Europeans can't tolerate the levels of chili that are in that food. And then, of course, you have the noodle bar explosion, which begins with the Chinese Alan Liao, who is actually using a Japanese style of architecture and mixing Chinese and Japanese cooking styles. And the idea of eating soups, because of course soups are very foundational in Chinese food, and bringing that as the sort of big bowl, one bowl meal type idea. And I think that is much healthier if you can make a good stock, which and
it seems a lot of mixing is happening, and all the British distinction between deep fry and stir fry. Do you think this has actually diluted the original Chinese identity of what we call Chinese food?
Well, what does original and authentic mean? Now, if you go back before the 16th century, there's no chili in China. It comes from South America. And so imagine Chinese food without chili to begin with. And if you go back even further, there are less and less ingredients. So the regional Chinese food isn't so clear, apart from in the south you eat rice and in the north you eat wheat-based foods. So once you begin to think about what's authentic, really what people are saying is it authentic according to current day standards of food in China? And as I said, that food changed with all the rulers. So with the Mongolian rulers, they would bring in more lamb and milk drinking and yogurt drinking and big bowl, the big soups and things that weren't there in China, in the southern parts of China before. So I come from sort of academic world where we think that everything changes and it should change. I also come from a father who created the British Chinese cuisine. So I don't really have a problem with Chinese food changing and it mixing with other cultures. I think it's really important and interesting to retain the identity of Hunanese cooking and of Sichuan cooking and of all these different regional variations. But in the end it will all change. The global nature of the world we live in will impact on, and the different palettes of international community means that it's inevitably going to change. So I don't know. Do I think it's a good thing or a bad thing? I just think it's going to happen because you can't stop it happening. And some elements of that are good, and they'll always be changed by contemporary fads, dietary fads, etc. And I do hope, that there will continue, or people will know more and more the variety of different foods there are in China, rather than imagining it's just one menu.
So is that variety, do you think it would become the prospect of Chinese food in Britain?
I think more and more that there will be, because I think it's commercially a good idea that people set up a Hunan restaurant, and there are many different regions of cooking that we don't have represented in the UK, and it would be lovely to see people doing that. At the same time, I think it's a good thing to innovate and to change the kind of food because always those regional types of food are not going to become big business because they don't suit the kind of restaurants which are franchised around, like Wagamama or like I don't know what other ones there are really. But if you want to franchise and spread in a network of restaurants, you have to have a very simple menu that is appealing to people up and down the country. So that inevitably means that you have to create an identifiable menu that is easy to cook and teach other people to cook. But that doesn't mean it has to be bad. It could be good. I think Wagamama, Alan Yao did a relatively good job, although now it's out of his hands. whereas he had a quality control on it. It's not as good as it used to be.
So do you think there will be more franchised Chinese restaurants in the future, or more like private, family-owned restaurants?
Surely there will be more franchised restaurants. With the Chinese migration as it is, I imagine that there will be more family-style restaurants as well. But Chinese food got a very bad name at a certain point as really Japanese food was taking off, because Japanese food grew. That's what's interesting. Japanese food grew at a time where people were becoming skinny obsessed, when they were becoming, eating not very much, eating steamed and soups and whatever. So Chinese food got a bad name for being deep fried and full of MSG at that time, and it's very easy to take the average stir fry and to criticise it. What hasn't caught on is Yaoshan and the medicinal food world, which is catching on and developing. Some of the finest food that I've eaten is in the Yaoshan restaurants in China, Yaoshan being medicinal food. And people are beginning to know about individual products. So you can buy goji berries in Waitrose and other types of Chinese medicinal foods, but nobody knows really how to cook with them in Europe. So they just eat them. And goji berries are not very nice when you just eat them. They're not as good as raisins but so you have to put them in wine, or you have to put them, you steam them with a few vegetables, or add them to steamed fish. But the problem is UK people don't know how to do that. I think there's a really big market for a Yaoshan restaurant, and really, if I was going to set up a restaurant, for 10 years I've wanted to do that actually, but I know how hard work it is setting up a restaurant. So I'd rather be like my father, do the front of the housework and develop the menu, and then hand it on to everybody else. But I still have this bad memory of it going badly, and the trauma and anxiety of losing so much money. And most restaurants, it seems to me, go down. Actually, it's not an easy business unless every member of the family is involved with it and is prepared to work for free. The economics of restauranting, unless you have a really good idea and pour enormous amount of money into it, then you have a chance of being fashionable and starting a fashion. I could have done that if I'd had backers, but actually at base it's not what I want to do.
And what's your personal opinion of MSG?
It makes your mouth very dry, and makes you drink loads of water, and it seems to make everything taste the same. So there was, this is a story I must find out, but there was an original Chinese flavour ingredient which was replaced by MSG, and I believe MSG came from Japan. So what it was that was used originally, I don't know. So maybe it was too expensive, or not available, or maybe the marketing of MSG was that much more successful than the maintenance of that early product. But I don't know what that product was. No, I don't think why do you need MSG? Foods taste fantastic. MSG is used by people who don't know how to flavour food.
And what do you think of the popularity of Chinese food in the future in the UK?
Well, with so many Chinese people in the UK, it's bound to get more and more popular, because those people will bring a better knowledge of Chinese food here, and surely we're going to appreciate that more and more. What's sad is always in the restaurant business, you've had top professors in the kitchen, because it's easier to make money cooking than it is in academic world. So what will the future of Chinese food be? I think it's very positive. And I think the challenge from Japanese food is also a good thing, because it's improved the quality of Chinese cooking. So, and it also raises awareness in the Chinese community that the British people, especially in urban areas, like in cities where people are more international, they can be discerning. They can tell the difference between good and bad Chinese food. And the more that good Chinese food becomes available, the better the whole Chinese food world will be.
Thank you for your time.